Good morning, and welcome to Re-envisioning Higher Education Funding to Advance Racial Equity. My name is Kim Everett, and I serve as the Managing Director at the Partnership for College Completion. I am joined today by Ayesha Safdar of Advance Illinois and Sonianne Lozada of the Partnership for College Completion, as well as a few esteemed panelists that I'll introduce later. Before we get started, I'd like to share a few housekeeping reminders. Some of you have already begun this, but please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and keep yourself muted during the presentation. Also be reminded that today's presentation is being recorded. Also, there will be an opportunity for questions during our panel later in the presentation. So at that time, you are welcome to add questions to the chat or unmute yourself and speak. So let's go ahead and get started. Illinois currently has the opportunity to reimagine the way it appropriates funds to higher education and emphasize the critical role that higher education plays in our state's future success. As you will hear, the most under-resourced universities disproportionately serve the students with the least wealth, and whose families and communities continue to be affected by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Illinois stands the best chance to attract diverse students, retain students from low-income households, cultivate local talent, and prepare for our state's future economy by prioritizing equity rather than level funding in its appropriations, as it's been done for the last 20 years. Today, we will highlight the important work that is happening at the state level in order to develop an equitable, adequate, and stable public university funding model, and how advocates, students, and higher education practitioners are getting involved. Lastly, you'll hear some of the ways that you too can get involved in this important work. So without further ado, I will pass things over to Ayesha.
Thanks, Kim. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the value of higher education, some of the issues and obstacles that we've seen in the higher ed landscape in Illinois in recent years, as well as potential solutions, including the role of the Commission on Equitable Public University Funding. Next slide. So today, higher education is really more important than ever. A lot of research shows strong links between higher ed and positive outcomes related to employment and income. And I'm going to talk about some of those links and the value of higher education in general. Next slide. A college degree is currently the clearest path towards employment and equity. So most of the jobs added since 2008 have actually required college credentials. If you look at this graph, it shows employment growth since 2008. So there is a significant increase in employment for bachelor's degrees holders. There's a slight increase for associate's degrees, and it is consistently in the negative for high school or less. So a college degree has over time become really critical, even more so in the workforce. Next slide. As important as a college degree is in general, research shows that a college degree is even more valuable for students of color, increasing lifetime earnings by 67% for Black college graduates and 78% for Latinx college graduates. So this is compared to about the 59% increase in earnings for white graduates. So it's a really huge value add overall, but particularly for students of color. Next slide. Another pattern that we've seen is that as education level increases, wages tend to rise and employment rates drop. So if you take a look at the unemployment rate, it's at about 5.5% for a high school graduate compared to about 2.4% for bachelor's or graduate degree holders. Similarly, you can see an increase in earnings for higher education attainment with about $31,000 for high school graduates compared to $56K for bachelor's degree and over. So ultimately, investing in higher education is good for the individual, but it also makes good economic sense in general. Studies have shown that the US economy misses out on about $956 billion a year due to these attainment gaps by economic status and by race. Next slide. So we've talked about the value of higher education. Now we're going to zoom in and take a look at the higher education landscape in Illinois, focusing on the institutions, the demographics, and the funding system. So a quick overview of the system. I'm sure many of you are aware, but the higher ed landscape in Illinois is made up of 3 agencies. Those are IBHE, ICCB, and ISAC. There are 48 community colleges, and there are also private institutions, not-for-profits, and for-profit institutions, as well as 12 public universities. Next slide. So just for context, this is the racial breakdown of Illinois' public universities. So 56% are white students, 17% Black, 14% Latinx, and 10% Asian American. And for additional context, Illinois ranks 17th out of 41 states for Black student representation and 34th out of 44 states for Latinx representation. So that's kind of how we fit into the national average. Next slide. So we're going to take a look at how Illinois' public universities are currently funded. There are 3 main buckets, and those are state funding, which is comprised of institutional funding, as well as student aid, such as MAP. There are also federal funds, which include student grants, loans, and research funding. And thirdly, student and consumer-driven sources, such as tuition and fees and other revenue from like sports or events, things like that. So those are the 3 main buckets. The focus of the recently launched Commission on Equitable Public University Funding is state funding, specifically institutional funding of public universities. So funding is absolutely critical across the higher education spectrum, including community college funding. And while the current community college funding model should absolutely be evaluated to ensure that it's effective and doesn't exacerbate inequities, this commission is prioritizing what we believe is the most urgent need, and that is the creation of a rational and evidence-based equitable funding system for our public universities. Next slide. So now we're going to discuss what the problem is and what some of the patterns we've seen in our public universities over the years. So over the last 10 years, Illinois has seen disinvestment in higher education. In 2002, Illinois appropriated about $2.2 billion to its public universities, and last year it appropriated about $1.2 billion. So students have had to make up that difference. In response to that disinvestment, we've seen increasing tuition and fees impacting affordability for students. Also, funding is not given out equitably based on, number of low-income students served or students of color. And finally, there are significant enrollment and completion gaps, specifically for Black and Latinx students, as well as students from low-income families. So disinvestment in higher education in Illinois has forced institutions to increase tuition and fees, like I said, impacting affordability for students. So this graph shows the decline in appropriation since 2000 in the orange line, and then in teal, you can see the increase in public university tuition and fees. So you can see that as the appropriations have gone down, universities have had to make up for it by increasing tuition. Next slide. So the impact of this disinvestment has been just disproportionate. Public universities vary in terms of their reliance on state funding. Some universities get more than 40% of their funding from the state, while better resource universities get less than 10%. And those universities that are more reliant on state funding tend to serve more students from low-income households as well as students of color. So if you look at this visual, it shows public universities in order of their reliance on state funding. The 3 universities that are the least reliant on state funding, UIC, UIUC, and ISU, their average student income is higher than the 9 institutions that are actually more reliant on state funding. And also, if you look at the darker green color, that indicates that those institutions serve a higher percentage of Black students. So we can see large concentrations of Black students in those institutions that are more reliant on state funding and serve students from families with a lower household income. And looking at Latinx students, we see slightly different trends. If you look at UIC, it does serve a large percentage of Latinx students, but there are still some concentrations of higher percentages of Latinx students in those universities that are more reliant on state funding. Next slide. So like I said, some universities have offset appropriations cuts with tuition increases. All institutions have increased tuition steadily over the past 20 years. Tuition has been relatively stable for the past couple of years, but this has been the trend over time. And actually the institutions that receive the largest percentage of state appropriations are the ones who have also increased tuition the most. Next slide. There are also significant racial equity gaps in enrollment and completion. So from 2008 to 2018, Illinois public higher education institutions have enrolled about 25,000 fewer Black students. Also, public 2-year and 4-year retention and completion rates of students of color is lower than that of their white counterparts. Black enrollment at selective universities remains unrepresentative of our state's diversity, as does Latinx enrollment. And if you look at this graph, it shows graduation rates of white students, Black students, and Latinx students within a normal time, which is considered 6 years. So if you look, you can see that 70% of white students are graduating within that 6-year time span, compared to only 53% of Latinx students and 38% of Black students. Next slide. So we can see that there are significant issues for our public universities in Illinois. There's disinvestment, there is the lack of affordability, there are huge equity gaps. So what can we do about that? We believe that the solution includes 2 core components. The first is to allocate more funding into the system to adequately support students. Adequate funds will lower costs to students, expand access, and support persistence. And secondly, it is to distribute that funding in a way that is equitable and stable. Equity-focused distribution mechanisms will also incentivize institutional action that drives racial and socioeconomic equity. So ultimately, hopefully enrolling more low-income students and more students of color and supporting those students to persistence and completion. Next slide. So that's what we think needs to happen. So talking about how it can happen, in November, the Commission on Equitable Public University Funding was launched to establish an equity-based funding model for the allocation of state funds to public universities. The Commission will evaluate existing funding methods while also recommending specific data-driven approaches to the General Assembly to fund Illinois public universities in a more equitable manner. And this commission is comprised of legislators, institutional representatives, as well as representatives from state agencies, nonprofits, and unions. And by July 1st, 2023, it'll publish its findings and recommendations. Next slide. So the commission is working to address just one piece of a much larger higher education ecosystem, but this is definitely an exciting step towards equitable and adequate funding in higher ed. And we believe that developing an equitable and adequate funding formula for Illinois public universities will ultimately help all Illinois students and create new possibilities in higher education. And with that, I will pass it to Sonianne to discuss the coalition, its role, and how to get involved.
Thank you so much, Ayesha. Thank you for everybody who attended today. My name is Sonianne Lozada. I serve as a community engagement manager at the Partnership for College Completion. As you just heard, Ayesha talk about what's been going on in the state with our higher education system, which clearly shows the need for more equitable and adequate funding for our higher education system. So, and how the Commission on Equitable Public University Funding is undertaking that important work. So, as she mentioned, I'll be discussing, and you can go to the next slide, sorry. I'll be discussing a little bit more about the Coalition on Transforming Higher Education Funding and its work to support equitable funding in the state of Illinois. So just a little bit of a background, the Coalition is a group of advocates, students and stakeholders who are committed to advancing equity in higher education and who are working simultaneously in parallel efforts to support the goals of the Commission and to drive more equitable funding in higher education. Slide. So I just wanted to share the theory of action with you. This is ultimately the vision of our work. And so, I'll read it to you quickly. It says, if we advance a public university model that prioritizes racial and socioeconomic equity, then we will see statewide increases in higher education equity through better resource institutions, serving more representative student populations, more resources directed to colleges, serving Black, Latinx, low-income, rural, and first-generation college students, and increased investment in higher education. And so, as I mentioned, this is the vision that we want to see for the work that we're doing. So as a coalition, we want to make sure that we're seeing more Black and Latinx students, not only accessing, but also completing their higher education. And this, we know that this can only happen if states and institutions that serve these students are held accountable to remediate the systems and structures that create the racial inequities that they face in higher education and in, like, its funding system. So we want to make sure that funding and other resources that are appropriated to public state universities are intentionally distributed equitably in those institutions once that funding reaches those institutions. So this is why we're bringing the coalition together. We believe that highlighting these issues and then finding ways to remedy them is important in order to move this work along. And as it says here, we want to make sure that we're advancing a public university model that works, that provides better resources, making sure that representation truly, truly does matter in these institutions, and that the investment in higher education is an equitable one. Slide. So what does this mean for the coalition's work? What we truly hope, what we want to see hope to be true is that we can build power through allies like you and through the allies that we're currently working with on the coalition. So these allies are not only meant to bring influence, but also bring your experiences, the experiences that perhaps have influenced and informed the current work that we're doing and the future work that we want to do. So we need you to move this work forward, and we need your passion, we need your stories, and we need the power that your organizations bring to also move this work forward. So we know that and it has been my experience in the higher education space, isn't like the early childhood space or the K-12 space, where it's full of a plethora of advocates who want to fight for our children, who want to fight for our youth. So sometimes there's this misconception that once a youth has made it to college, that they've made it and they'll continue to make it. But in some cases, that isn't always true. As adults, as we continue to need support as adults, and we need to find information and resources to continue to advance our role in society, our role as professionals, so on and so forth. These young people that are in college also need the help to move forward and to be successful in their college completion. So this is why this is a great opportunity for us to continue to create a network of advocates with the purpose of raising awareness, to elevate our voices and empower others to do the same, to then therefore create equity. And in doing so, we advocate for equity, and throughout the commission's work, we support the development of this work to provide them recommendations to advance the equitable institutional formula. Right? So as we continue to learn more about Illinois' higher education system and why it matters in our journey towards equity, I'm super excited to introduce this next section of the session, which is our panel discussion, where we'll get to hear from individuals who will share their work and their experiences. And so I'll pass it now to Dr. Kim Everett, who will be moderating this discussion.
Next slide, please. I have the pleasure of introducing our esteemed panelists here who will share insights on the importance and impact of a new path forward. Thank you, Sonianne and Ayesha, for that context. Dr. Jennifer Garrison is the superintendent of the Vandalia Community Unit School District number 203 and an active educational equity leader in the state of Illinois. She was a staunch advocate for the passing of the K-12 funding formula, or the EBF, and is currently serving as a board member on the Illinois Board of Higher Education. Next, we have Dr. April Bernard, who is the chair and associate professor of criminal justice at Chicago State University. Dr. Bernard earned her doctorate in social policy from the School of Education at Northwestern University and has over 20 years of experience in higher education as a professor and administrator, serving at predominantly Black and Latinx serving institutions in Chicago as well as the Caribbean. And last but not least, we have Ale Natera. Ale is a recent graduate, having finished her degree at UIC in 2021, earning a degree in political science and Latin American and Latino studies. Ale is also a member of the Partnership for College Completions Advisory Board. Thank you. Let's stop sharing screen now so that we can see one another's faces. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions of the panel in just a moment, so feel free to go ahead and start adding those to the chat. But when there's I'll let you know when it's time to unmute yourself and we can have more conversation. Our first question is for you, Dr. Garrison. As someone who was involved in the creation of the evidence-based funding formula model for K-12, what role did advocates play in that process? And what can advocates who are pushing for equitable funding in the higher education space learn from that process?
Good morning, and thank you for having me. I'm going to be reinforcing a lot of what has been said, which is good because we have alignment. I hadn't seen this slide deck prior to this, but I just want to start off with advocates play a critical role. Without the advocates, this will not happen. So a coalition has already been formed, which is wonderful. So anybody listening, it's how can you play a role in that coalition? And from the K-12 experience, as a superintendent, we formed what's called Equity First, which aligns perfect with the title of this conference. So we're called Equity First Superintendents. We're still an active group of superintendents throughout the state advocating for equity, but we were formed through EBF, or the push for EBF. And also with that, we had Funding Illinois' Future, which was the larger stakeholder group of advocates. We had faith leaders, we had parent organizations, we had teachers, we had superintendents. So you have to think global about who needs to be represented in the coalition, and bringing all those voices together in a coalition. I would recommend, and maybe this has already been done, but once you have those stakeholders identified, that you must all understand one definition of equity. What does equity mean for the 12 public universities in the state of Illinois, whether you're at Carbondale or UIC? So that's the first thing, a common goal of equity. Then from there, develop your guiding principles. Once you have those guiding principles, then I would recommend creating 1 or 2 pagers. And you can go to Partnership of College Completion and see a lot of this work has already really been started. I'm just going to highlight Partnership for College Completion as a great resource for the coalition. And then you have to be clear and consistent with the messaging. So once you have the coalition, it's going to take, I call it boots on the ground. So localizing the action in the communities that these universities serve. And I think the unique opportunity for higher education is really to put the student voice first. That's why we're here. We're advocating for the students telling their story. The thing I remember most about the Partnership for College Completion releasing their report in 2019 was whether it was talking about low-income rural students or the Black students. We had a common theme from our first-generation students. Our high school students did not see a path to education in Vandalia or in Chicago. So I know the synergy and the energy is there. It's finding the people statewide who are passionate to tell their story and to own their story. And the one thing about telling your story is people can disagree with you, but it's still your story. So that's the one thing I want to highlight is find the student voice, be the backbone to help those students lead this charge. You're going to find, why do we need to change? The data is very clear of why we need to change. I think I heard it was 2.2 billion and now it's 1.2 billion. Basic graphics data speaks volumes. So I'll pause there and I'll turn it over to the next person.
Thank you, Dr. Garrison. Our next question is for Dr. Bernard. Dr. Bernard, the commission is charged with making recommendations for an equitable, adequate, and stable funding model for public universities. What specific considerations should be taken into account in order to ensure equity, and why?
Thank you, Kim, for the question, and everyone for being here. I'm happy to respond to this question on behalf of Chicago State University. In doing so, I want to just very briefly refer persons to the presentation by Kim Tran, who's our Chief of Staff here. He did a presentation yesterday on revisioning higher education funding to advance racial equity. That presentation really gives you a good idea of how unique institutions like Chicago State University are. We are a predominantly Black serving institution. Over 70% of our population is African American, 96% Pell eligible, 48% first gen. And research by Andre Perry at the Brookings Institute suggests that institutions like Chicago State University that have similar missions serving predominantly Black students or predominantly Black institutions have been historically underfunded. And again, if you take a look at a lot of the statistics that have been covered in other sessions, we can definitely understand the impact of not being able to maximize the potential of our Black students in the state, and how we all are dependent and interdependent on each other's success. In Kim's presentation, you'll also see information about the Equity Working Group for Black Student Access and Success in Higher Education, started by President Z. Scott here. It was a multi-sector working group that really looked at addressing the root causes of equity gaps across the state. And so we've done a great job of talking about the problem being systemic racism and the funding and disinvestment, particularly in predominantly Black institutions across the state. And we have really been focusing a lot on disparities at the student level. I want to just take a minute to emphasize that we also need to understand what the disparities at the institutional level look like. And how do we fix those? And how do we focus on fixing those at the onset, particularly for predominantly Black institutions, given their mission is serving those students who are most impacted by inequitable funding. And so our solution, our SB 815 solution is, to focus on that moral obligation for equity and attainment. And we talk about equity and funding, and we will be drilling down on what that means, and what it has meant in many other states is outcomes-based funding. Now I want to get to the considerations just real quickly. And those considerations really focus on outcomes-based funding. And so outcomes-based funding, while being an efficient way of kind of justifying why we're funding things the way we are and holding institutions accountable, again, given that outcomes-based funding works best when there is an even playing field, we need to not assume that the playing field is even, and we need to assess at baseline what that playing field looks like before the competition begins. We've done a lot of assessment at the student level. I am encouraged that we do more assessment at the institutional level to really assess readiness for change. And even as we're doing the assessments of students, we're talking about, some of the traditional demographic data. We've not really drilled down to look at assessments about their readiness for the changes that need to happen in institutions across the state. Readiness at the institutional level, there's lots of really good work on change management that will help us to do that type of assessment and make sure that we're communicating about those needs so that those areas can be represented in the formula and incentives if that is the way that we decide we want to go. Really focusing in on those institutional missions and measures. Some of these outcomes-based funding models have a hold harmless policy that stays in place and then disappears after a while. Really perhaps considering whether or not there needs to be a distinct funding formula and incentives and policies around the hold harmless policy staying in place for predominantly Black serving institutions. Student population variance and intersectionality. We have disaggregated the data and done a great job of doing that at the state level. I'm encouraging that we do a little bit more disaggregation within groups so that as we are looking at the incentives that we are developing, and as we look at the formulas and the weight of the formulas, we're able to tell, as a previous presenter stated, different groups are described as being impacted by the same problem. But when we really dig down and look at those groups, their differences between groups and differences within, we're going to be able to provide much better, much more targeted, much more responsive interventions. And again, that can end up impacting the weighting of the formula if we have more information about that. It also helps us to avoid the creaming effect, which is, taking those most easily to serve. So, many of our universities are already serving those Black students who are likely to excel in any institution very well. We need to really look at those who are most marginalized, those who are dealing with insecurities. And in regard to insecurities, outcomes-based funding works best when there are evidence-based practices coupled with them. And so evidence-based practices for predominantly Black populations that are also low income and really at those multiple intersections that increase their vulnerability, it shows that we also need to take a look at their insecurities, whether it's food insecurity, housing insecurity, to help them on that path toward enrollment and graduation. We have a focus on wellness and well-being, but really specifying what that means, particularly for those most vulnerable populations. And last but not least is the funding formula and incentives must also account for differences in the amount of patients and upfront resource infusion needed to build the infrastructure and culture of innovation that's necessary to really create a much more even playing field to create more equitable outcomes. Thank you.
So much to consider. Thank you. And as advised by Dr. Garrison, we want to hear some from a student, well, at least a recent alum. Ale, thank you for joining us today. And I would love to hear from your experience at UIC. What have been some of the impacts of disinvestment on the student experience?
Yes, so I graduated from UIC just last semester. I was a transfer student, like I know many other students. And UIC, I think what is particular about UIC is that it's about an 80% commuter school, and I was one of those students as well. So being a commuter at UIC is pretty much the norm for most students. And that deters from the college experience in the sense that many students are focused on simply going to their classes and then going back home to work and then continue on with their daily lives. So this means that student involvement on campus is essentially, I would want to say, limited because of that commuter status. And this has to do a lot with funding in the sense that students don't have adequate funding to either live on campus or to live close to campus or to simply have an option, to decide whether to go to school or go to work. So I think that's one of the first things. I think as a transfer student myself, I also noticed that at the point of transferring, it was basically everything was on my shoulders in the sense that I didn't necessarily know, I wasn't necessarily guided, this is the loan that you have, these are your options, these are the classes that you need. First met with admissions, I was told that I was going, to spend an extra year in school because of the credits that weren't going to transfer and whatnot. And that's when I myself made the decision, to investigate and see what other options I had on campus, to consult with someone else. And I found Lattice, which is the Latin American Recruitment and Educational Services at UIC, targeted specifically for Latin American low-income, minority students. And at Lattice, I was actually told, you can actually graduate early. You have enough credits and whatnot. And I think that for me, if I would have simply stuck with the first thing that I heard, that definitely would have been a deterrent to either continue my studies, or especially during the pandemic when I was like, I'm essentially paying to go to school online. And I think that was a deterrent for many students as well. But I think that has to do a lot with funding in the sense that students, especially commuter students who aren't on campus all the time and don't know the extent of the resources that are available. Students aren't taking advantage of these resources because there simply isn't a bridge for transfer students or for students, in general, that makes it accessible to know essentially the resources that we have on campus. And even with the pandemic itself, one of the first programs that received, cuts was Readiness, was these programs that are targeted for minority, first generation, low income students. So I think for me, my experiences as a commuter and a transfer student, were definitely impacted by insufficient funding and insufficient bridge programs for students like myself.
Thank you for sharing that, Ale, and I am grateful that you found the resources that were necessary in order for you to be able to succeed at UIC. So congratulations again on your recent graduation. Tell us a little bit more about the things that you hope that the commission members will take into account as they move this work forward, hoping that other students won't have the same experience that you have.
Yeah, so I believe that the commission should consider essentially a funding system that reaches its most vulnerable populations. So for example, mothers who seem, to go to school because they have no one to take care for their kids and whatnot. Commuter students like myself or other students that had to travel from Waukegan to, the city, that's an hour and a half almost daily. So, you can't really be on campus and whatnot. Students with disabilities, LGBTQ community and whatnot. I believe that the commission should really consider what the college experience should be like because I know too many, the college experience is different. Some of us have to worry about, working 2 jobs to get through to school. Others, have the opportunity to live on campus and, not necessarily work and whatnot. But students who essentially commute or are faced with additional, stones along the way, essentially are deterred to go to school. And I believe that's why UIC has a graduation rate of 57%. Students are not completing their college degrees because there's not enough support, there's not enough funding, there's not enough there's not enough resources available for students that don't essentially have to choose whether they have to work or take care of their child and then go to school. So I believe that the commission just should consider what a college experience should be like. And I know it's going to be different for everyone, but at least find ways to make it attainable and provide an even playing field for everyone who wants to pursue their education.
And in this spirit of dreaming about a different way, Dr. Bernard, I'm going to ask you to share with us a little bit about what dreams could come true for Chicago State if an equitable funding formula were to happen. What things could you bring to fruition?
I appreciate the question. And again, want to refer everyone back to Kim Tran's presentation. You'll see that there's an executive summary graphic that came out of the equity working group. And it really focuses on evidence-based practices that can make college more affordable, increase enrollment, increase student well-being, and connect students to careers. Under each of those areas. And Chicago State University is already doing some of that work. And so increased and equitable funding would help us to expand our Cougar commitment to summer bridge programs, working with middle and high school students. We have a RISE Academy that works with first-time freshmen who need a little extra support transitioning to college. It's a 1-year program. We'd love to make it a 4-year program for those students. We've got several programs in our Department of Education to increase the number of teachers that we have. Those programs, the cohorts are small. We'd like to expand the cohorts. We'd like to expand those types of mentoring, financial support, advising support, comprehensive programs that Ali was just talking about are needed for our students, expand them across programs. And we have been offering emergency funding. We'd like to continue to do that. One of the highlights that we're about to open this semester is a child development center. So we will have, Ali, a child care center on campus for parents who are students and they have children between the ages of 3 and 12. We'd love to have additional funding to offer that support for parents that have infants to 3-year-old all the way up to 12. We've got several programs around career development, and internships are one of the great sells for many of our higher enrolled programs. We'd like to offer internships across programs and make sure that they're paid. Again, as Ali was clearly stating, many of our students have to work. It's not an option. And so a paid internship where they're getting on-the-job training and some payment definitely will help make those programs and opportunities much more beneficial. Thank you.
Thank you all for sharing some of the reasons why this is important and some of the possibilities of what could happen as this work moves forward. I have one final question for Dr. Garrison, but before we do that, I want to open up the floor for questions between our panelists, if you have thoughts or reactions to one another, as well as from those who are here gathered with us. If you have questions, feel free to add them to the chat or go ahead and unmute yourself and share.
I have a question for Dr. Garrison. Can you talk about what were indicators of readiness for change? I just feel that we're assuming that, you know, with more funding, change is just automatically going to happen. It's all going to be wonderful. Can you talk, based on your experience, what does readiness for change look like?
Readiness for change as far as passing the new funding formula, or from a system level, a school district, university perspective?
Well, let's start off. I think we have a general agreement that we definitely want to implement some type of funding formula. So at the institutional level or systemic level.
It really, your question aligns nicely to the evidence-based practices. So in our EBF formula, evidence-based funding, we have evidence-based practices, but really that commitment. And this is how it's so different with universities than it is with public schools. So we have over 850 public school districts in the state of Illinois, and we have 12 public universities. But from the local level, it's really, once we pass the evidence-based funding formula, tier 1 schools, which are the least adequately funded, had been disinvested, just like public university, through the years of what we called proration, and then the budget impasse. They went hand in hand, the budget impasse and proration. So really it takes a team at the local level to invest in those evidence-based practices and align your budgets to those practices. So for example, in Vandalia, this is my 4th year here, we had cut teachers at the elementary level. We served low-income students. So that was the first evidence-based practice that we put forward, that we needed to reduce classroom size. Then we also had a budget deficit. So we were borrowing money and collecting taxes, which I can kind of connect to student tuition at the university. So we also made, at the board level, we said we want to reduce overall tax burden. So for universities, tuition burden, as we continue to get more state funding. So we're holding our tax rate flat. We've actually lowered it since EBF passed in 2017, and I correlate that to how we could lower tuition at public universities. And then now we've gone into following another evidence-based practice. So to be more succinct, it's finding your leadership team at the university that the Board of Trustees will also agree and buy into, and holding one another accountable for the outcomes of those best practices. Did I answer your question adequately?
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yep.
Yes.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Feel free to unmute.
I'd like to thank Ali for your presentation and sharing your experience with us, and join others in just celebrating that you were able to get the things that you needed, and wish you very well on your future endeavors.
No, thank you. My pleasure. And I hope to, speak on behalf of other students as well. Thank you for having me.
Hopefully we're moving closer to a place where we won't need the convergence of grace that ensured that Ale was able to successfully navigate her way through UIC. As we continue to work to advocate for an adequate, equitable, and stable funding formula, I'll go ahead and move to our last question if there are no others from the audience right now. Okay. Continuing to draw parallels from the work that you did with our K-12 funding model, Dr. Garrison, can you, and you've already underscored the importance of advocates in this process, can you share a little bit more about the ways that advocates can best amplify their voices in this work? What tactics did organizations use or able to employ in order to help stakeholders, the public, as well as policymakers, to understand the gravity of the disinvestment and the need to address the inequity in the ways that funding has been allocated?
I'll share a few tactics, and then I'll also pause for questions to follow up and for others to share their experience. So I'm going to do the back mapping for you. It was a question I was going to pose, but knowing the commission's report should be coming out July of 23, I would advise the coalition to really start building what I call the backbone. ISAC also uses backbone in our leadership communities, but to build that backbone, to continue to have a voice at the commission. So when that report comes out in 23, that you have identified, because this is going to take legislative votes. And we're going to get into some of the harder conversations of what do we need to do to get the votes to pass, both the Senate, the House, and to get the governor's signature. And in higher education and in K-12 education, we call it turf or entrenched interest. There's going to be a push against there's going to be a push to keep the status quo, and the advocates have to be strong in their convictions. And I'm not going to lie, it was hard work, but it was a commitment that we were invested in. To give you a timeline of how long it took K-12, I hope that higher education can move faster if you can build this coalition in the next year, a strong coalition. I started in 2013. So I have to remember when my son was born, because I was starting to testify at the time. I had first learned out I was pregnant, but I wasn't able to share yet. And we finally passed the funding formula in 2017 before he went to kindergarten. So, you know, as a mother, from birth until he was entering kindergarten, it took 5 years of intense work where we didn't have the same commission structure that you do. We have what's called a PRP, a professional review panel now. So I'm hoping that the commission and the advocates can start to align and push together and find your legislative cheerleaders, the ones who are going to network with others to say, you need to vote for the equitable and adequate higher ed funding formula, and here is why. And those conversations are going to happen in small groups. You have to build relationships to get those votes. And we called it mapping. We worked with Advance Illinois, but we had called it mapping. Like, we had to map out how to get the 60 votes in the House so that we could get a governor's veto. And then eventually we got to the evidence-based funding formula. But I'm going to pause and let you ask follow-up questions because I lived the work, so I want to make sure that I'm clear in my communication.
I want to think back to something that you shared with us in your earlier comments around coming together around a single definition, because I imagine that is the first step, as you said, in that long path toward. What were some of the ways that you were able to find alignment while continuing to maintain a steadfast conviction to the spirit of the work, but making enough space for all of the advocates to see themselves in it?
You just said what I was everybody has to be able to see themselves to then bring forward their story. If you have people my age, I'm middle-aged, I'll just leave it that way. So I'm a first generation college student as well. I know college is very different than it is now. Affordability has dropped, but I can support now a student who, 30 years later is going through a different journey, but I can help coach him or her in the background. But the first step is, and I'll just say from Chicago to Carbondale, looking at the spectrum of the state with our public universities, that you have to be able to bring Chicago and Carbondale or Western to a place where every student can see themselves in that conversation, whether they're attending Chicago or Western. So you have to make space, no matter what we look like, that we can share the definition of equity together. And I'm going to reference another partnership for college completion. So as I was preparing for this, this is maybe a little bit long, but still I think it hits at where I think a good place to start, and maybe the coalition has already done this. Our focus is on solutions that ensure every Illinois student, so every Illinois student can see him or herself, has equitable access to a college education at an institution supportive of their academic and career plans, regardless of their race, family income, or wealth. Obviously, those evidence-based practices are going to drive the inputs of the funding formula for the outcomes. But I found that as one high-level statement that I thought might resonate with everybody being able to see themselves. I don't know if anybody wants to react to that, like working together, building the coalition on this call or this meeting.
Yes, please. Let's hear. What did that spark for anyone in the audience? Any immediate reactions?
I would say that I'm encouraged by hearing them said. I'm encouraged that there is lots of work to do, that we can put a effort forward. It's also we're moving in the right direction. There is also sure that we're getting that we're moving past that we want.
We missed a little bit of what you said there, Sonianne. So if you would like to clarify a little bit, maybe drop a few notes for us in the chat. We seem to have, I had a little bit of trouble hearing you, but thank you for sharing that still. Any other thoughts or reactions or reflections? There's a lot to think about, and there is a lot to consider. But today is not your last opportunity to join in this conversation. In fact, that is the way that we will wrap up our time here, unless there are additional thoughts, questions, comments for Dr. Garrison or Dr. Bernard or Ale, or reactions to the things that have been sparked for any of you as you spent this time with us this morning.
I haven't worn my IBHE hat, so the last thing I will say is I think we have a board in place as a result of our strategic plan that will help in our full-time jobs, not the role of the IBHE, but I feel confident that this board, as we have seen in our executive director and Chair Atkinson, is really committed to this work. So I would say IBHE is a friend and an advocate in this work as well, and take a look at the strategic plan if needed to reinforce that.
Perfect, excellent. And I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing their insights and their stories and expertise on this morning. And as we close our time together, I will turn things back over to Sonianne so that we could hear a little bit more about the ways that each of you can get involved.
Absolutely, thank you so much. If it's not too much to ask, are we able to share the screen again to share the last slide? Thanks so much. So while that's taking place, I'll just reiterate the thank you from Dr. Everett. Thank you Thank you to you, Dr. Everett, for moderating today's panel discussion, and a big thank you to our speakers for sharing your work, your knowledge, and your experience with us. As we wrap up, I wanted to just share some ways, as Dr. Everett mentioned, that you can get involved in this work, especially when it comes to the equitable funding piece of this work. And so the first thing is that I would encourage you, if you are interested, if you have the time and the capacity, to become a member of the Coalition for Transforming Higher Education Funding. There's many different ways that you can join, as you see on the screen. You can join as a member of the NECS, through your organization, through your school, as an individual, etc. To learn more about ways that you can get involved, please feel free to reach out to me. I know my information will be shared at the end of this session, and I am happy to chat further with you about the work that we're doing with the coalition. Also, we're really excited about an event that we're having next week, as we talk about advocacy and the power of advocacy, and making sure that we're elevating our voices and that we're all sharing the same message. Next week, we will be hosting our second annual and first virtual Illinois Higher Ed Advocacy Day, which will take place on March 9th. And we will kick off the day with a rally that'll take place at 10 a.m. and will be from 10 to 11 a.m. All of the participants will get to hear from nonprofit leaders in this space that are doing this work, in addition to some of our champions, some of our elected official champions, which are Representative Katie Stewart and Senator Cristina Pasiones Sayas, as well as you will also, as we love to hear from students, we love to hear them share their stories and their experiences. It empowers us. It continues to increase the passion in us to move forward and fight for them. So you'll get to hear from two Illinois college students that are will be sharing their experience in the higher education space, and what we can do to ensure that their continued experience is a positive one, and that we increase that positive experience for the students that are entering that space. So following the rally, there will be an opportunity for advocates to continue to engage in advocacy throughout the day. One of those opportunities is to participate in 30-minute legislator meetings throughout the day, and you will have to register for those meetings as well as for the rally, and that registration information will be shared in the link. I'm sorry, that's my daughter in the background. And so, but in addition to like meeting with legislators, there's a lot of opportunities to just storm your social media forum, storm your feeds, post throughout the day, urging the Illinois General Assembly to prioritize equitable funding and solutions for Illinois higher education. So as I mentioned, I know that some of the links have been shared in the chat, so please feel free to register if you're interested in joining us for the day, even if it's to join us for the rally portion of the day. If you're busy the rest of the day, we'd really love to see your faces, and we would really love for you all to join us and in raising our voices for a better equitable funding for our Illinois students. And the last thing I'll share is as we talk about urging the Illinois General Assembly to continue to adopt and prioritize equitable funding solutions, we've been already starting to advocate for the MAP grant, right? So we've been advocating to urge the Illinois General Assembly to adopt the $122 million increase investment that Governor Pritzker proposed in his FY23 budget for the MAP grant. And we wanted to share a toolkit with you that was just released on March 1st, so that you can help us advocate for this increase. And so inside the toolkit, you'll find everything that you need to be able to advocate. There's a social media bank with images and captions that you can upload on social media for each day that we're advocating, from March 1st to March 10th. You can literally upload it to your Twitter accounts or to other social media accounts, download the image. There's even a caption that you can attach to that image. So essentially we've done all the work for you, and all you have to do is upload those images. In addition to the social media piece and the social media bank, there are draft email templates that you can send to your state senator and representatives, accompanied with a call script if you would like just to call their offices and urge them to vote for the proposed increased budget for MAP. And you will also in that toolkit find information about Advocacy Day included there as well. And I believe that toolkit has also been shared in the chat. So once again, we thank you so much for your participation today. We ask that you please reach out to us with any questions, or if you'd like to chat further, about the work that we're doing to advance equitable funding in the state of Illinois, learn more about the coalition. If you have questions about Advocacy Day, we would love to hear from you, and I'm happy to chat offline about that. So we hope to see you next week during Advocacy Day if you're available, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference.